We're going to get back to the business of public safety and law enforcement. That's what our role is. We need to get back to fighting crime.
And that is interim Seattle Police Chief Sue Rahr talking about a renewed spirit towards dealing with crime in the city of Seattle. But how's that going to happen with continued not-so-great news on police hiring? Plus, what's behind a new city plan to send people booked on misdemeanors to a jail outside of Seattle? Also, we're looking at how the shakeup in the presidential picture on the national front could impact what's looking like a challenging year for some Democrat priorities at the state level. All this and a whole lot more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on Seattle Channel, and the views expressed here are mine, and I am back with my co-host, David Croman. David, I think we had a shared moment last week when the CrowdStrike crisis knocked out technology around the globe, hurting air travel, hospitals, among other institutions. But as much as I could really have used a day off from being stuck behind this computer, my tech was working just fine. How about you?
Yeah, so was mine. I opened my computer sort of almost hoping to see the blue screen, but no dice. Everything was working just fine. So I had to work.
Yeah, I know, as did I. But, well, we're glad to be back at work, David. I think that's the right way to look at it here. And I thank you, as always, for joining me here. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. And a special thanks to our show patrons. A shout out to Sam, who wrote in a question recently. Sam, I'm going to try to do some more research on what you're asking and get back in touch. Thank you for reaching out. Become a patron and get access to Patrons First podcasts before anyone else. And like with Sam, we will answer your questions on the show. You even get an awesome Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. How about that? So find this podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of this podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get the party started. Time for Right Here, Right Now. David, before we dive into the larger public safety update that's going on in the City Council this week here in Seattle, I want to take a closer look at the piece you wrote for the Seattle Times recently about the City of Seattle temporarily incarcerating people arrested on misdemeanors in a jail down in Des Moines. The jail is called SCORE, the South Correctional Facility. And I guess the first question is, why? Why does Seattle need to send people who are arrested here down to Des Moines rather than just using the King County Jail downtown?
Well, really, because the King County Jail downtown is still operating at a pretty severely limited capacity. This was a move they took at the early part of the pandemic as a sort of public health precaution, but it has stayed in place mostly because of staffing. They just have not been able to staff the entire jail. So the result is, Seattle before the pandemic generally expected around 200 beds available to them because the city leases space from the King County jails. That is now down around closer to 70 or 80. And so the result is that what the city is allowed to book into the jail is just like pretty limited. And so there has been this conversation for a while now, particularly among the new city council, which has been much more focused on the public safety question, or at least, and has been much more willing to be take a little bit of a more, law and order tone toward that. And so, ultimately what the city does with the jail is up to the mayor, but they had been pressuring the mayor to do something around this. And so the choice for now is to contract with this jail in South King County, which is owned and operated by a collection of cities down there, in addition to what they have normally done with the counties. It's comes with a lot of sort of question marks about how operationally this is going to work and sort of the facility itself, but that seems to be where this is headed.
Yeah, let's dive into that. I want to talk about the logistical issues because I know the municipal court here in Seattle has brought that up. Essentially, the cases would be adjudicated in Seattle, but I guess the incarceration would happen in Des Moines. That's one issue here. And then also this facility itself has not had a number of great reports when it comes to safety of the inmates that are there. Can you dive into that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I'd say there's sort of three big question marks here. The first one is philosophical on a broad scale, which is do you agree that it is beneficial to jail more people on misdemeanor crimes? There are plenty of folks that you can find who say no, that we don't think a 1 to 3 day jail stay for shoplifting is that beneficial to anybody. That's kind of one larger debate that the city isn't going to resolve overnight. But then there are the debates sort of specifically around this move. One is just, does SCORE, this facility, offer the kinds of services that people want in jail, which is, treatment options and sort of discharge services and things like that. And, some service providers say that their clients report sort of worse conditions at SCORE than at the other two jails. So that's one. And then the other is just sort of basic operations, which is, how is the Seattle Municipal Court, which is already slammed and backed up, going to handle sort of this new stream of people coming into the court? And how do you get people from the jail in Des Moines up to Seattle? Because the municipal court is sort of bound by code for how many judges they can have. So it's not like they can expand. They can't bring in a bunch of pro tem judges to ease the kind of burden of this. So there's just a lot of basic questions around how this is actually going to function.
Yeah, and can you go back to that philosophical question? Because I think that's underpinning this whole thing. We have a city council right now that's very eager to really get after it with these misdemeanors and really try to prosecute them, and a city attorney that is very much focused on that as well. And that seems to be a shift. I think it's something that we've all seen coming here. But how is that playing out? Is that going to be a clash with the municipal court too? Because I know that there are some judges there who haven't wanted to be, acting in that way, really punishing these misdemeanors with more jail time, which doesn't always turn into some good results for the person who is incarcerated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is going to be a key point that is made, but I think it's going to be made mostly externally. I think within City Hall, there's fairly unanimous agreement that 80 beds is not enough beds. And they point out, look, we're not trying to get, because at one point the city had 400 beds. And so that number had come down a lot before the pandemic. And so their argument is, look, we're not trying to get back to what former city attorney Pete Holmes was working with. And no one was really accusing Pete Holmes of being a super hardliner prosecutor or anything. So we're just trying to get back to where we were pre-pandemic. Right. But there is the question mark of, the city says that it wants to connect people with treatment and things like that. But what we're talking about here is mostly people spending 24 to 72 hours in jail. And the defense lawyers say that is just not enough time to actually ever expect that you're going to connect those people with treatments. And, oh, by the way, it's not like we're putting them away for life. They'll be back to their sort of normal day-to-day life. So if your concern is, as a victim of shoplifting, is to never see this person again, this isn't going to accomplish that. But I think the city sees this at the end of the day as, if they want to get people into treatment, they need some kind of leverage point. And right now they feel like they don't have that without the legitimate threat of jail, because there are certain misdemeanors right now where that there is literally zero threat of going to jail, because the jail has stated explicitly, we do not book people for shoplifting right now. And so, that's where things stand.
Yeah, got it. Well, I will be very interested to see how that plays out here. So that's going to be playing out over the next couple of months. And David, thank you for keeping an eye on that. But next up, let's talk about this, a wide-ranging public safety update from Interim Chief Sue Rahr from the Seattle Police Department in council chambers this week. She's talking about increasing public safety, but also about a continued lack of police officers. The most recent figures shown this week actually indicate that of the 65 hires planned for the first half of this year, only 21 came through. Slightly better news, if you want to look at it that way, with separations, meaning officers leaving the department. 63 were planned for, only 55 actually happened. So fewer officers leaving than the SPD thought, but definitely not meeting those hiring goals. And David, I was really struck by Chief Rahr's approach to treat her work like a sprint, like a marathon, seeing as how she's going to be with the department for a short amount of time. She does want to crank things up a notch. And from what she was describing this week, like trying to find new ways to streamline officer hiring or involving some real-time crime center tech that could help with officer dispatch, was there enough there to say to you, the SPD really is going to see some positive results when it comes to police hiring fairly quickly? Did you get a vibe for that at all?
I think what she was talking about is kind of what we have been talking about for a while. The city council has at least, we're talking about process, moving people through more quickly, more efficient use of resources. Those things are all fine. I don't think they're going to be the things that really make a difference. Which isn't to say, though, that we might not see more increases in recruits, but I would say that's probably mostly because Seattle officers went from being, 29th best paid in the state to first recently.
Number one,
so,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would say if of anything that has happened in the last year that would could make a meaningful difference, it's probably that. But,
yeah.
I think unfortunately, when you're talking about recruitment like this, the reality is it's slow. And so, I think these are the sort of tactics that maybe they would have preferred to be deploying in 2018 when they, were saying, hey, we do want to grow the force, but it's not at like crisis mode. So, you pull some levers here and then you can add an officer or two, and that's fine when your sort of base levels are basically okay. But
right.
When
because this was an issue that was going on before the pandemic. When we talk about losing officers, that was happening with the SPD and other agencies around the country.
Yeah, I remember in 2015, Ed Murray proposing, adding more officers. Mm-hmm. And so this has been, I think Mike McGinn talked about it too. I mean, this has been a thing that they have wanted to do for a long time, but that's just a much easier position to be in when your baseline levels are basically okay. But if you're trying to sort of dig your way out of where the department is now, which is pretty darn low, the fact of the matter is there's just no overnight lever to pull that's really going to make the difference.
Yeah. I was also struck in what Chief Farrar was saying, that she was describing how complaints about officers are handled by the city. She talked about the Office of Police Accountability, or the OPA, being so backlogged with minor complaints that the system was really clogged up and not working as efficiently as it could. And I guess it's a good time to bring up that Farrar recently fired Officer Daniel Auderer last week for his comments over the death of pedestrian Janavi Kanjala after she was struck by an SPD cruiser. But I was looking at this, David, and Chief Farrar was speaking about agencies like the OPA or the OIG, the Inspector General, as an outsourcing of discipline, which I kind of thought was the point, to have some outside the SPD input on these cases. I really saw this as, I guess, some criticisms of the way the OPA and the OIG was working. I don't want to push it too far, but what did you make of what she was saying about trying to improve how officer discipline is handled by the SPD?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting complaint, and it's one that I don't think is entirely new. I know officers have been bringing this up for a long time. Mm-hmm. OPA theoretically does have a rapid adjudication process, which is basically, usually super minor level stuff, or officer says, hey, I screwed up. I agree. I did this. Let's just take care of this. Mm-hmm. I don't know. And I didn't quite glean from her report how frequently that's being used. Yeah. My sense is not that if it's backing up like this. Yeah. Also, the office just got super backed up, I think, in 2020, and I'm not sure they've ever really recovered from that.
Right.
So, there's a balance here, because we're also talking about the very accountability structure that is keeping the department under the supervision of a federal judge. So it's not like this is the kind of area where they can't really make changes without basically getting express approval from the judge. And so it's, it's tricky territory.
Yeah, it really is. And when you talk about that backup of cases, I mean, when there were those different crowd events, then there were, riots, et cetera, and different clashes with the police over what was happening after the George Floyd murder, et cetera, Black Lives Matter and all that. There were individual complaints against dozens upon dozens of officers, and I know that those were handled. But you're right, this is an agency, at least the OPA I'm thinking about, that has been through quite a bit over the last few months and years here. So I'm interested to see what follows up from that, because I thought that was an interesting criticism that she brought up, and I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, just in terms of what the federal judge has to say about it too. So I appreciate the back and forth on that, David, but I wanted to talk about more public safety concerns with you. More coming to the fore this week with the swearing in of Amy Smith as Seattle's first permanent chief of the CARE Department, Community Assisted Response and Engagement. We're going to break down the story behind the story on Now Hear This. Well, Amy Smith is no longer an interim chief. She has been sworn in this week as the first permanent chief of Seattle's CARE Department, which oversees 911 and the crisis responder teams, which go to so-called low acuity calls like well person checks that don't necessarily need an armed officer on the scene. But CARE is used in a dual dispatch capacity, meaning SPD officers check out a call first, then get CARE involved, and then let CARE do the work by themselves as officers peel off to other cases there. So why not send CARE by themselves? Council President Sarah Nelson asked that question of Chief Smith, and here's how she responded.
If I know it's an overdose, why can't I just send Health 99 with a peer who has lived experience, who often is the unique person who can get the conversation going, can create the opportunity? There's no reason I can't do that other than I do need to negotiate with labor, right? I'm talking about several different unions. The CSOs have different representation than police officers do. I've got a dispatchers guild. So those conversations are important.
And listeners, if you haven't heard the 2 episodes from this podcast over the last couple of months where I've interviewed Chief Smith, make sure you check him out. Very open and transparent person, has some interesting new ideas about how to approach public safety. But David, this is really where the rubber meets the road for me. It's great to talk about revising our 911 dispatch center and determining beforehand which resources are best for each call. And it sounds like Chief Smith is definitely working on that. But what about when she has to reckon with the Seattle Police Officers Guild, which is the SPD's biggest union, or the union that oversees 911 operators for that matter? How will those negotiations with those different labor organizations impact her current effort to spread CARE's crisis responder teams citywide?
Yeah, the recent contract made some strides towards kind of opening things up for civilian response, but right. This is just the thing about policing, is it always comes kind of back to what the contract looks like, and what the labor unions are doing, and this is a good example where if you talk to kind of individual officers, they're basically uniformly game with having civilian or sort of alternative response
right.
systems here, but at the end of the day, the union is loath to give up kind of any of its job tasks, any of its duties, which is typical union. It's just most people don't think about it as much as they do with the police union. So as far as its ability to actually be an alternative, I think it does come a lot down to that. I mean, it's going to expand.
To all parts of the city after just being downtown with this pilot project that started back in October. Keep going.
Yeah, it's going to expand. I would be curious to see how, it does seem like there is an opportunity for it to kind of leverage other organizations that are not like, I'm thinking about LEAD specifically, that are not city departments, but are doing a lot of the sort of work that CARE says it wants to be doing. And so, what kind of relationship they have with them, if they can form that can sort of amplify, I think, theoretically, their reach.
I'm with you on that. And Chief Smith was actually talking about this idea of maybe having groups like LEAD, which does a lot of outreach work, tries to divert people from jail. This is Let Everyone Advance with Dignity, as it's known, formerly known as Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion. Also groups like We Deliver Care, for that matter, which has a focus on 3rd Avenue downtown. Chief Smith was talking about the possibility of even dispatching or having a connection with these different groups from within 911, such that she could help them or work with them or use their resources with the city here. It seemed like a very interesting big picture idea. And I think you started to touch on this, David. How would that work, or how would that change things, or would that be a good idea, I guess, bottom line?
Yeah, I don't know how it would work functionally, but I do know that there is some sense. I think the folks who are involved with LEAD and do LEAD are perfectly happy with the idea of CARE and more resources to do it. It sounds like, just real quick, David, I have heard from Chief Smith that her crews are running into these LEAD crews or whatever else out in the field, and it's happening. I mean, they know each other already, but I just wanted to bring that up. For sure, yeah. But I think there is there's a sense sometimes of like, why are we, why are we adding new stuff here when we have people kind of doing this work? Like, LEAD is like pretty big at this point and has a lot of support. And so I think the people at LEAD and PDA, the umbrella organization, would be open to the idea of, forming maybe a more formal relationship with CARE. But, I don't know what the mechanics of that look like. But yeah, I mean, I think if it's starting to look, and this isn't a good thing, a little bit like the homelessness landscape, which is you have just a lot of different sort of arms doing kind of similar things, but it's not entirely clear which is the main one and how well they're coordinating. We're not nearly to the level of where the homelessness system is at, but there are hints of something like that. And I think there's some awareness among the people who do that work that it's probably worth having a conversation about how to better to coordinate all these things.
Right. Don't want to be too duplicative in those efforts, but you want to make sure that you're organizing everything for certain. So I'll be very interested to see how that part of the conversation goes. Thanks a lot for that, David. I did want to make mention of the fact that, yes, there is a new Democrat candidate for president of the United States in Kamala Harris. And while that has led to reportedly record-breaking amounts of donations to the Democratic National Committee, it really had me thinking about some Democrat priorities in Washington state that look to be in some kind of trouble. And David, I was looking at your colleague Paul Roberts in his piece, who wrote about this in the Times, a poll conducted by Survey USA for the Times, King 5, and the UW's Center for an Informed Public. The poll was talking about rolling back the capital gains tax, which is the question posed by Initiative 2109. The number showed 46% of people would vote to roll back the tax, 23% would oppose a repeal, and 31% were not certain. And David, as we've discussed before, the money from this capital gains tax goes to education, early learning, childcare, school construction, which was not mentioned in this poll. Very important part there. But as Democrats celebrate a new candidate nationally, should they be worried about these poll numbers facing one of their top priorities, education funding, here in Washington state? What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. I think they should be worried. I think particularly when you're talking about taxes or, gas, there's some other initiatives, around the carbon market or the payroll tax.
And long-term care as well.
And, we're talking about taxes and, how much people are going to have to pay in taxes, even if, as with the capital gains, even if it's a thing that only a very small slice of people in the state pay, it still has to do with taxes. And, even in a fairly liberal Washington state, previous ballot measures to do with income taxes have all done quite badly. And, I think initiatives in general, people are a little... So I will say this, though, which is, as you kind of alluded to, the polling didn't use the language of the ballot measure. And so I do think to an extent, there's some people who just don't entirely understand. They're saying yes to say no to something, essentially.
Yes. Right.
Which is a little bit confusing. And then, it didn't lay out the kind of financial impacts if these things were repealed. So you imagine there's a little movement there. And then also, pollsters will tell you when you ask about initiatives, the yes vote on initiatives tends to go down the closer to the actual day, of the vote. And so I think two things are true, which is this is not good polling if you are supportive of the, carbon market and the long-term payroll tax and capital gains tax. This is bad polling for you.
Right.
And also it's not a done deal because there are just some question marks around, what it looks like when you pull initiatives generally.
Yeah. And I guess I should also point out that one number that I threw out there, 31% of the people said they weren't certain. So there's a third of the electorate out there potentially that you need to really educate about this. So, and I think that's going to be a big push over the next several months here. We'll see if there's any of the national Democratic wave of support for Kamala Harris that'll involve some dollars here locally, but we'll see what happens because there's a lot of different priorities here on the ballot that Democrats have been supporting for years that could be in some serious trouble with these different initiatives put forth by Let's Go Washington. All right, well, coming up here, why do you think that some businesses are crying foul over a bargain that was forged 10 years ago over employee wages with the city of Seattle? It's actually set to go into effect next year. We'll hear about what they're saying, what local unions are saying, and more. David took a deep dive on this issue. He's going to explain what's going on. Coming up on What's Next. Quick shout out to our patrons. We love doing the You Ask, We Answer segment here. Patrons send in questions. We need more of you to write us if you'd please. Sam, we did get your question. We'll work on some answers next week. Please email us at seattlenewsviewsandbrews@gmail.com. Spell it out. We'll work on answering the questions you might have. Please and thank you. But David, I did want to talk about the story you had in the Times where you said the restaurant industry was scrambling with a new minimum wage that's set to go into effect at the start of next year, which in some cases could be an increase of $3 per hour. This is all based off a deal the city brokered with businesses back in 2015, where there was a push to raise the minimum wage. Can you give us some context here? Why are so many restaurants upset?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the biggest jump in minimum wage for businesses 500 and under since the $15 minimum wage began sort of coming into effect. And, I think more than that, it has it has arrived quietly. At the time, this was this deal that was struck to give small businesses more time to adjust to the higher minimum wage. Basically, they gave them 10 years. But now everyone who was involved in those conversations has long since kind of left City Hall and is not involved in the as involved in the public scene. And so here we are now with this brand new city council, 6 out of 9. I'm not convinced that all of them knew that this was coming at all. And so now, I wrote about it because there's the lobbying effort from the restaurant industry has gotten kind of intense. And I know that the city council is interested in delaying this kind of bump in the minimum wage. The question, though, is whether they're going to have time. And it kind of seems like no.
Just because there's so much work that needs to go on with the budget before the fall time and things like that. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I did want to talk about this, too, in terms of labor and what they're saying about this, because I think as sympathetic as they may be to businesses who might be in a bind about this, I think they're also saying, hey, this was the deal that was brokered 10 years ago. And if you can't figure this out, foul's on you. How do you look at that piece of it in terms of what labor's saying about this whole agreement?
Yeah, because, at the time, this was not a guarantee that small businesses would get this amount of time anyway. I mean, this was kind of a last-minute deal with these small businesses to finally push this proposal across the finish line. And so now they're saying, hey, look, you got special treatment. This was not a guarantee that you would get this benefit to begin with. And now you're sort of treating it as if it is a permanent thing that you should have in perpetuity. That was not the deal we made at the time. You've had 10 years to prepare for this. If you're not prepared, that is your own fault. And so it's fairly simple and straightforward argument, but that's what it is.
Yeah, and just a last touch on this in terms of what restaurants are saying. They're saying this could be a really, really big cost per month, and some of them saying that they just wouldn't be able to withstand that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it'll be a big bump, and I think it would spur further changes in the restaurant industry, be it more counter service, fewer staff generally, some closures possibly. But again, I think the proponents of this argue, hey, look, if you have an industry built on underpaying people, then that should be corrected. And that's what this minimum wage is doing. That's what they're arguing.
Yeah, boy, we will see what happens with that one. A lot of different players involved there. It sounded like Councilmember Hollingsworth was interested in trying to work on something. But again, the time is very limited here as we get closer to the fall time when the council is really 100% focused on figuring out a budget for the following year. But thank you very much for that, David. I did want to make sure I wrapped up with you. And listeners, quick update. David and I are actually planning to go to a Mariners game together for the first time this week, and I can't wait. But I need to ask, are you going to this game as every time I go to the game they lose, David, or cautiously optimistic, David? Who's showing up?
David, who's happy to sit out in the sun and just, enjoy some baseball and not think too hard about the team that I'm watching.
I know that's about the only way to do it. In between everybody who's injured or getting cut from the team, I'm not quite sure what we're going to see, but I'm looking forward to it, my man, and also looking forward to hearing more people give us some feedback on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, the podcast where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Make sure you reach out to us. Seattle News, Views, and Brews at gmail.com. Become a patron if you could. I want to thank especially the patrons who support the show. If you would like to become a patron, find this podcast on Patreon, Seattle News, Views, and Brews. You can hear us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you like to listen. We are there for you. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media, and we'll see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2024.